So our guest today for this session of Learning About Learning is my friend and colleague, Sharon Avni. Sharon is an associate professor at CUNY, and she's also an affiliated scholar at the Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education. She is an applied linguist with a particular focus on the teaching and learning of Hebrew. Last year, she co-authored a book about Hebrew in American Jewish summer camps that I hope some of you had the chance to read. It was great. We actually had an event last spring where we talked about that book, and we'll post a link to that event in the chat. There it is in the chat. Today we're talking about another piece of her scholarship, a chapter that's part of a book project on Hebrew speakers in the US. And that particular chapter that we're going to talk about today focuses on Hebrew accents. So with that introduction, let's dive in. Sharon, welcome. It's good to see you.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's start with some background. As I said, we're talking about a chapter you've written. It's about American Jewish Hebrew accents, and it's part of this book about American Hebrew. So tell us about the larger project. Why are you interested in this?
Sure. Okay. So for years now, I have been looking at Hebrew in the American context and I've looked at all sorts of settings, day schools, public schools, camps, and I've always felt like there was more to say in totality about modern Hebrew in the American context. And so after some of these projects finished up, I was able to really start thinking about that. And so this book, what I hope will be a book, is going to look at what this language means in the American context for American Jews and others, and not what they know or what they can do with the language, but more what the language does for them. And so I'm hoping that through a lens of modern Hebrew, and I want to just underscore that really this is about modern Hebrew, I'm hoping to be able to say something about the contemporary American Jewish community.
Interesting. Okay, so that's it's sort of using language as a lens into some important issues in American Jewish sociology, American Jewish ideology. Great. So in this particular chapter, you're focused on accents, as we said. You actually there's an earlier chapter that looks at the kind of linguistic characteristics of accents. I'm sure that would be fascinating to kind of tease out what, but that's not going to be our topic today. This chapter is about how American Jews talk and think about their accents. So how do you do this work? What's the relevant data to understand that question?
Sure. Okay. So before I even get to that, can I just take a step back and just say what brought me to this? Because originally, when I started, because I think what brought me to this informs a little bit of the methodology. Originally, when I was thinking about this project, I wasn't thinking about accent, and it really a few things were happening at the same time. The first was that I read a book by Naomi Sokoloff and Nancy Berg. I believe it's called What Do We Mean? Wait, what do we? Oh, it's got a great title. 1 second, I have it right here. Probably in my list. What we talk about when we talk about Hebrew. Sorry. And so in this book, which is a bunch of scholars and thoughtful people writing about what Hebrew means to them, they use this word Hebraist by choice. And I love that phrase. I thought to myself, wow, this is a great phrase. What does it mean to be a modern day Hebraist? And I was thinking about that. And over the years since I've been doing my work, people have always said, oh, Sharon, you should speak to my cousin John. Because John is one of these people who spends 10 hours a day or, 10 hours a week studying Hebrew by himself or whatever. And I would say, oh, yeah, one day I'd be happy to speak to John, your cousin. And then all of a sudden, that phrase about a modern day Hebraist made me think, well, maybe I should start talking to these people. So I
Hmm.
started little by little to undertake these conversations, and I was trying to understand who are these modern day Hebraists. So that was going on. At the same time, then there was this, COVID. The pandemic started, and then there was this article, and maybe we'll talk about it a little later. But there was this article, or not an article. I'm sorry. There was a clip that was in the Israeli on one of the Israeli television stations, and it was one of Rafi Reshev, an Israeli
Journalist.
journalist, talking to an American woman, a woman probably in her 70s, who was back in the gym after the pandemic, and it was sort of touting Israel's vaccination success. In any event, she is an American woman who moved to Israel at one point, and in this conversation, she clearly has an American Hebrew accent,
Yeah, we should tell
and
people so her name is Effie Hertzky, and she's like an 80-year-old woman, and
right.
she's on a treadmill, like she's actually working out. He's interviewing her as he's working out. Yeah, okay, keep going.
Yeah, and she's really just a lovely character, of a person you can see. And so this interview is maybe 2 or 3 minutes. And what surprised me, it was picked up in the press because so many people were so interested in this interview, and there were so many comments about her accent. Gosh, this accent, and her use of English, Hebrew, and everything like that. And so I started to think to myself, wait a second, what's going on here? Why are people so focused on her accent? And I guess maybe because it was the pandemic and everything like that, that I decided, I'm going to write a short piece
Uh-huh.
just about this particular thing in her accent. And one day I sat down, a few hours, wrote this piece, sent it off to JTA. It was published. I thought, for my mom, make my mom happy and a few friends, whatever. To make a long story short, the piece, all sorts of people started contacting me. Um, oh, I'm so glad you wrote this. My accent, so many people. And I thought to myself, there's something here and I need to explore this. So
Uh-huh.
that's sort of what brought me to accent. And then I started going back to many of the interviews I'd been doing with what I was calling my modern day Hebraeus. And
Hmm.
I started to realize that I had coded a lot for accent and
Yeah.
people talking about their accent. I hadn't realized how salient of a thing it was. So I
Yeah.
thought, well, how do I study this? So one thing were the actual interviews with
Mhm.
people and up till now, it's been about 115 interviews
Wow.
that I've done with what I call my modern day Hebraists, which are
Yeah.
quite an eclectic group of people, but everyone is over the age of 21, I should just say. And so this is a study about adults.
Yeah.
So one thing was to look at these interviews and what people are saying about their accents. And also what I found really interesting in these interviews is when they mock their accents,
Hmm.
when they mock Israeli Hebrew speakers,
Right.
that was
So,
one thing. Another thing was just trying to isolate, well, what is this accent? And so doing some more like sociolinguistic kind of research where, playing a recording of a speaker, speaking in this, and asking people, you know, how does this person sound to you? Does this person sound educated? Does this person sound, and there's all sorts of methodologies for doing that kind of research. So I did some of that. Like how is this accent, with what is it associated? A third thing that I've been doing is looking at how the accent is actually written and talked about in the media, both
mhm.
in Israel and throughout the United States. And then the
Right. So that's
fourth
the
thing,
discourse. That's sort of the
yes,
discourse in the media about
the
American
accent.
Hebrew accents. Yeah.
And then the fourth thing was actually looking at how the accent is represented in things like movies and other kinds of cultural products and
Yeah.
media. So
Yeah.
all of
Nice.
those things have kind of come together, and offered a really interesting methodological approach to getting at this accent.
Yeah, at the phenomenon in all of its variety. I'm going to post a link to a YouTube clip. This is not actually the original clip of Effie Hursky. I couldn't find that one, but this is a sort of a news story about the
Right,
phenomenon, the Effie Hursky phenomenon. Maybe the next, I don't know, a few days later or something.
right.
That people can look at if they want. So she went viral, and then there were follow up interviews, and it was quite funny. And there's one piece that actually I don't think we have time to talk about. That's about translanguaging and her use of English words interwoven into Hebrew. Itself a fascinating phenomenon. But I think actually we don't have time to talk about it. But let's just focus in on the accent. And as you said, you in listening to these American Hebraists, your American Hebraists, you hear them talking about accent, and that feels very relatable to me. And I would say many of my peers, friends, are have a certain kind of self consciousness about American Hebrew accents. Even many of us who are quite fluent in Hebrew, sometimes there's the criticism of a fake accent, right? My kids get very anxious if they think that Abba, they refer to me as having a fake accent, so that's always difficult to navigate. So what's going on here? Why are American, typically Jews, not only, but typically Jews, when they're speaking Hebrew, why is there such a focus on accent?
Well, I think in general, accent, as a lot of research in linguistic anthropology shows us, accent is it is a linguistic reality, meaning, people speak and pronounce things in different ways. But really, what is important to me is really its social meaning. And so, it's the meaning that's attached to an accent that's important. And we know that the accents are about evaluations. What people say about accents are usually a judgment or some sort of evaluative comment about a person or the group that that person represents, right? And so through that kind of meta-linguistic discourse, talk, in other words, you can really get at, the priorities, the values, the beliefs. So what I mean is you can get at priorities, values, beliefs, commitments, expectations about what that group represents. And so I think that it's not surprising that accent um, a salient factor among American Jews with Hebrew. I think it's a salient factor in almost all groups. Even in the United States with English, we talk a lot about um, uh, the English accent
Sure.
in the United States. What's surprising to me was that it was not. It hasn't been more studied,
Mhm.
um, and so we talk about it, but we don't really study it in a more in a contemporary way.
And yeah, in a systematic way, right? So and by our here now, I'm thinking about um, American, typically American Jews, American Hebraists, what you're calling American Hebraists. The conversation about accents seems to be part of the conversation about the language pretty
Right.
consistently. What do you make about of this question of fake accent, of
Ah,
American Jews shouldn't use a quote fake accent, which,
yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure, but I think in when I'm trying to speak French, not that I do that very well, but if I'm trying to speak French, I think I'm trying to sound like whatever French sounds like to my ear. I'm trying to represent that. I wouldn't say I have a fake French. Maybe I would. I'm not sure. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, accents are a way of creating symbolic boundaries between groups. And so, they're always connected to a notion of authenticity, that there
Mm-hmm.
is this real, authentic way of sounding, of being a Hebrew speaker.
Mm-hmm.
Now, historically, I'm not a historian, but because of this project, I've been able to really immerse myself in the sort of the history of the revitalization of Hebrew, specifically around the notion of accent. And this has always been a contested thing about what is the authentic way that this nation should sound. Because the sound is connected to an identity. And so, you know, the notion of a fake or not being authentic enough, again, this is just an evaluation, and I'm not sure what the real accent is, because if you go even to Israel, you hear a variety
Right.
and different accents. Different is Israeli accents of Hebrew have different social meaning even today. So historically, for sure, and even today. I mean, that's one of the things that's also interesting, is how much is written that I was able to find about the American Hebrew accent, where I didn't, at least, or how it's portrayed by Israelis or how they talk about it. And I didn't really see as much about French or Russians or other groups in Israel, which I think is sort of, interesting in and of
Right.
themselves. They might be written in French and Russian, and I just haven't, come
Yeah.
across it in my own
Yeah.
research.
And you write a little bit about this in the chapter. It's a fascinating story. The conscious and intentional development um, of let's say a normative Israeli accent, right, which was more or less a modern invention, right, like a hodgepodge of other things, like elevating some things, suppressing others, using different linguistic elements from different diaspora communities that were then around. And we're not actually going to focus on that, but I do think that it's just fascinating to think that when we talk about quote a fake accent, in some way we're saying, I, John Levison, I'm not an Israeli. I don't have the right, in some way, I don't have the right to use that accent. It's not authentic to me, right? Even though if I'm an Israeli taxi, right, I'm just speaking Hebrew to the Israeli taxi driver, right? I'm just trying to converse, but somehow there's also this anxiety or concern about, like, do I have the right to actually speak this way?
Right. I mean, I think to some degree, language is never just about communication. It's also about a lot of signaling. It does a lot of identity work. It does a lot of aesthetic kind of work. But I don't know if it's so much, if I'm thinking about it at this point, about the right. I mean, based on the data that I'm seeing, I think that in some ways the accent, first of all, I would have to say that it's a really socially recognized thing. So when I talk to people about the American Hebrew accent, everybody automatically knows what I mean. Because I ask people, do you know what I mean when I say that? Or tell me what you think I mean, when I said, so at least we're talking about this thing. And everyone recognizes it. Ani, rotsa, lalech, it's a particular, everyone nasalizes. It's a very particular, they use the same words. It's very interesting, sort of. But I'm not sure that people are saying, I don't have the right, and therefore I'm not going to try. One of the things that I hear is more, I don't necessarily need this language in my life as an American Jew.
And these are among the Hebraics. These are people who
Yeah,
are, yeah.
yeah, they might have the synagogue skills or other skills with Hebrew that let them do other things in their Jewish lives. But in terms of modern Hebrew, I'm hearing, and I'm paraphrasing, but I've worked really hard to acquire this language, and I don't think of myself as Israeli, and I don't think of that as a bad thing. Meaning, this is who I am. I'm an American Jew. I've worked really hard, sometimes over the course of people's lives, to acquire this language, and I'm just really proud of myself.
Despite the fact that I don't have a Hebrew accent, an
Yeah,
Israeli accent, I have an American accent.
yeah, and that,
And that's okay.
I want people to know I'm an American.
Uh-huh.
Like,
Uh-huh.
I'm not trying to like. So I hear that. So I'm, so I don't hear people saying I don't have a right to
Okay.
speak like in Israeli. Now I do have to say there are some people to whom the normative or a very Hebrew Israeli Hebrew accent is very important to them, and they have superb Hebrew on every level. But I would say by and large that was not what I'm encountering.
Yeah.
And
So let me
then
ask you
yeah.
then. So because there's a line that you wrote at one point in the chapter that was really intriguing to me. You wrote, and this is a quote: "Knowledge of a language can amplify the differences within a group." Right. So we typically think that knowledge of language brings people together, but in this line, in this place in this chapter, you're saying knowledge of language can amplify the differences within the group. Can you explain what you meant there?
Yeah, I think that this chapter has made me question this assumption, or what I would think of almost as a language ideology, a belief about what Hebrew can do for Jewish peoplehood. And
Mm-hmm.
so we have this idea that Hebrew um, unifies, and it's this common Jewish language. And I think to some degree, very true, whether people know it or not. Meaning, so that's another thing, like um, that attracted to me to this whole project is what does it mean to be so attached to a language that you actually don't know, which is sort of. So I think that there's still something to that. But what I'm finding in my things is that often around accent, it's more of a divider actually, and it's a way for people, it's a way for Israelis to project Americans and American Jews particularly in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
uh, the accent is feminized, weak, diasporic, gullible. um, Whereas, the Americans on their side are saying, I don't want to sound harsh. I don't want to be pushy. So we have these stereotypes
Yep.
of cultures that come out, and so I think by seeing this, no, I'm not saying that accent is the cause for the differences. I just think that it's a way for these kinds of boundaries or borders to be set up between these
Yeah.
groups.
Yeah, so interesting. So, as you said, both of these things are happening at the same time. Language can be a unifier, right? There, people can communicate across difference with the language, and particularly with accent, it can start to demarcate divisions, right? American Jews versus Israeli Jews in that case, and presumably, and there are a couple of questions about this, which I won't have time to get into from the audience. Especially in subgroups in Israel, like the different accents that different subgroups in Israel have, can also really serve to demarcate those groups. So we only have a couple minutes left, and I want to ask you about the key takeaways when you think, like, when you pull back the lens. What do you think the key takeaways are from this work?
Well, I think at this point, in this process of sort of going through the data, writing it up, one of my takeaways is we have to look at the sound of American Jews and sort of how they are using Hebrew in creative ways. And again, I think the mocking has been really interesting because when do they try to sound like is when do they try to take on an Israeli accent? When they don't, I think that there's something to be said for the sound of American Jews that is important.
Mm-hmm.
I think it has educational implications. Now, it's not something in general. I was telling you this before. Broadly, I haven't found that much written about accent and Hebrew education in Jewish education, in Hebrew education specifically. And I think that's really interesting. Like, why has that been left out?
Mhm.
And, often we focus on what is being said and not how it's being said, but we know that how is just as important because, again, we make a lot of evaluations and assumptions about the speaker. Now,
Right.
that is not me saying, I don't want to be misunderstood, that we should be focused on teaching accent in schools or anything like that, but I think that it raises awareness about the way that American Jews use language
Yep.
to do different types of identity work, um, and how accent either is can be both a big thing and a small thing at the same
Yeah.
time
Yeah.
in that work.
Yeah. I mean, when I think about sort of all of the stories about American Jews learning particular linguistic forms that then they go to Israel and they try and those forms out and they find that Israelis don't actually use those particular forms. But as you said, that's about the substantive content of the language, and then there's this whole element that doesn't seem like we really examined very closely and haven't really thought about in terms of the education
I
piece.
just think of it as a local flavor at this point. Like, what does it say about sort of the localized, American Jewish experience? And to me, it's as real as anything
Yeah.
else.
So the last question, what was the biggest surprise for you in doing this work?
Um, yeah, there were so many, actually.
Yeah.
There's so many, but I think the biggest surprise to me, to be quite honest, was just how few people cared about what they sounded like,
Hmm.
and their enormous pride. Again, I mentioned it before, but I just wasn't expecting that. And to be honest, I should have, because I myself, I'm not a native Israeli. I didn't grow up speaking Hebrew or anything like that. I acquired it as an adult, and I've gone through different, iterations of my own Hebrew accent and my own sort of relationship with that accent. And I guess I should have not have been surprised, and yet I was, by how many people put in such tremendous effort and so much time and so much love for this language, and just feel that um, you know, that this is a way for them to mark who they are. So I
Mhm.
guess that was a
Right.
surprise.
Interesting. Right. So we might have thought that there's a kind of the goal is, and everybody should share the goal of speaking like an Israeli. And what you're hearing in the data is maybe not. Maybe
Maybe
not. For
not.
these folks, they seem to think that, I mean, they're committed to Hebrew, they want to learn Hebrew, but not necessarily, at least, here, at least not necessarily to actually speak like an Israeli.
I would just add, I think it just raises questions also about how we define fluency,
Mhm.
or, what it means to be competent.
Yeah.
Because, so I'll just,
Great.
end it with that. But
Thank you. Okay, we will wrap up here. Thank you, Sharon. It's so much fun to talk with you about this work. Thank you all for joining us. I encourage you to check out the Mandel Center events page to learn about other upcoming events. I'm going to mention three really quickly, but the link will go up into the chat. In just a few weeks, on Thursday, March 24th, we will have a book launch for a new book called Inside Jewish Day Schools, with Alex Thompson and Jack Wertheimer. This is the first book in our Mandel Brandeis series in Jewish education at Brandeis University Press. Then on April 11th, we'll have the next of these conversations, these Learning About Learning conversations with Professor Ari Kelman. And then on May 4th, the last of this series for the year will be a conversation with Dr. Michal Biton. Again, learning about learning. The topic then will be how Jewish communities educate. Please take a look at the events page and at our website. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you all for joining us. Be well. Take care.